Okay, so you've sent over these excerpts from President Steinbaum's latest press conference,
Yeah.
and it seems like you're really interested in kind of digging into what her vision for Mexico is.
Yeah, I think what's so interesting about this press conference is it gives us a glimpse not just into her policies, but her governing style.
Okay.
Um, and she comes out swinging. That statement about Gustavo Petro being practically the only progressive president that Colombia has had,
Yeah.
that's a pretty bold statement.
It is. It's aligning herself very clearly with another leader, especially someone like Petro. I mean,
Yeah, and a self-described democratic socialist, too.
right.
I mean, she is really signaling where her ideology lies,
Yeah.
in terms of this pink tide that we're seeing in Latin America.
Mm.
So I think it's really fascinating, and it begs the question of, how is this going to affect Mexico's relationship with Colombia, but also more broadly on the world stage? How is this going to affect their relationship with the United States?
Right. And the U.S. has such a long and complicated history with Latin America, as is, and this kind of throws a wrench into things.
Absolutely.
So it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah.
But speaking of shaking things up, let's talk about these constitutional reforms, starting with the railways.
Okay.
Now, Mexico's rail system, I mean, it has a long and winding history. Can you give us a little bit of context?
Yeah, so you're right. The railways have a very long history.
Yeah.
And, back in the 1990s, Mexico went through a wave of privatization.
Right.
And so they handed over a lot of the control of these railways to private companies, hoping that this would increase efficiency.
Okay.
But as a result, we saw this decline in passenger rail, especially in rural areas. A lot of these companies were much more focused on cargo transport.
Makes sense.
So Sheinbaum's proposal to kind of reclaim these lines and utilize them for passenger transport could be huge, especially for those rural communities that have really been left behind by this, more privatized system.
So it's about connecting communities, creating economic opportunities, but I imagine this isn't going to be without its challenges.
Right.
And I think she even mentioned something about existing contracts with these companies.
Yeah, she did mention that, in these original contracts, there's, language about being able to reclaim these lines for this purpose.
Okay.
But we can be sure that those private companies are not going to be happy about this.
Yeah.
There's going to be pushbacks.
Right.
They're going to be concerned about, their profits being affected and just the logistics of it all.
Right. So it's going to be a real balancing act.
Absolutely. A delicate balancing act for the Sheinbaum administration.
Okay. So we've got kind of this high stakes game of chess happening here.
Yeah.
Between public good and private interests.
For sure.
And now let's move on to another hot button issue, which is energy.
Oh, okay.
Sheinbaum's proposing a pretty significant shift here, essentially reversing the 2013 energy reform.
Yeah.
Why is this such a big deal?
So energy in Mexico is about way more than just keeping the lights on.
Okay.
It's, really tied to their sense of national identity and economic sovereignty. And that 2013 reform, which opened up the energy sector to private companies, to foreign companies, was incredibly controversial.
Right.
And so Sheinbaum is really arguing that it wasn't in the best interest of the Mexican people.
Okay.
It really prioritized these private profits over the needs of the people.
Yeah.
It weakened these national companies like CFE and Pemex.
Right.
And really made Mexico reliant on these foreign entities.
Yeah.
So her proposal to kind of take back control of these companies and make them public again is a bold statement.
It is.
But it remains to be seen how this is going to affect energy prices, investments, and just Mexico's overall energy independence.
So she's framing this as a correction.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
Righting a wrong from the past.
Mhm.
It's about putting Mexican interests first. But what are the potential downsides to this approach?
Well, of course, there are valid concerns about whether this is going to stifle competition, deter foreign investment,
Right.
and lead to inefficiencies within these companies.
Okay.
And so, critics are saying that while that 2013 reform had its flaws, it did bring in a lot of investment and expertise into the country.
Okay.
So it's going to be a real test to see if the Sheinbaum administration can address those concerns, attract new investment, and actually deliver on the promise of affordable energy.
Yeah. So it's a gamble
It is a gamble.
that she seems very confident in taking.
Yeah.
She's got a vision for Mexico that's rooted in a strong sense of national sovereignty, but it's not all about grand gestures.
Right.
And these big ideological pronouncements. The press conference also touched on some very real challenges that Mexico is facing, especially when it comes to security.
Yes. And this is where I think Sheinbaum's approach gets really, really interesting. Because she's talking about some states like Guerrero and Sinaloa
Right.
that have been hit hard by drug-related violence.
Yeah.
And she very much is, moving away from that traditional war on drugs strategy that we've seen for decades.
She's advocating for something a little bit more holistic, right?
Exactly.
It's about addressing the root causes of this violence.
Absolutely. It's a multi-pronged approach.
Right.
She's talking about addressing those root socioeconomic factors like poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity.
Right.
And really moving away from just this, reliance on military force and focusing more on community policing, gathering intelligence, and really importantly, building trust with the community.
It's a tough one.
It is.
It's so complex.
Yeah.
There are no easy answers, but I find it interesting that she's emphasizing intelligence and that community engagement. So it's about shifting that power dynamic.
Absolutely.
Moving away from this top-down militarized approach to something that's more collaborative. But realistically, how effective do you think this will be in those areas where these cartels have such a strong hold?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
It really hinges on the government's ability to root out corruption within law enforcement and build that trust.
Right.
Because these are communities that have been marginalized and terrorized by both the cartels and by corrupt officials.
Right.
So it's a long game.
Yeah.
But it could yield much more sustainable results in the long run.
It's like trying to untangle this giant knot, right?
It is.
You can't just address the symptoms. You have to get to the root of the problem.
Yeah.
But shifting gears a little bit here.
Yeah.
The press conference wasn't all about security and constitutional reform.
Right.
She touched on a whole range of issues.
She did.
From the economy to even Mexico's relationship with Spain.
It really shows the breadth of, what a president has to deal with.
Right. It's a lot.
All these different things going on.
It's like spinning plates.
Absolutely.
Trying to keep it all balanced.
Trying to keep it all in the air, right?
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that I thought was interesting was her mention of Social Security for gig workers.
Yeah.
I mean, that feels very 21st century.
It's a global trend.
Right.
We're seeing this more and more.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see how Mexico is responding, because she seems to be acknowledging that, this traditional safety net might not be enough for this new type of workforce.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what they come up with.
Yeah, and then there was that reference to Mexico's relationship with Spain.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, this call for an apology for the Spanish conquest.
Yeah, that's a can of worms.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
That's a whole other deep dive.
Exactly. And, this isn't new. This has been something that we've heard during the Lopez Obrador years as well.
Okay.
So it's interesting to see her picking up that mantle.
Yeah.
How she engages with this could have, big implications.
Big time.
Diplomatically, culturally.
Yeah, it's like she's walking a tightrope here.
It is.
Because she's acknowledging these historical injustices.
Right.
But also trying to maintain this very functional relationship.
Yeah. You don't want to completely alienate Spain in this.
Right.
But it speaks to her broader approach, I think, to leadership, which is, she's willing to address these tough issues head on.
Even if it ruffles some feathers.
Even if it makes people uncomfortable. And we see that even in just the way she delivers some of these statements. There's this real confidence. There's a directness, even a hint of defiance.
Yeah, she's not afraid of a little controversy.
She's not. And I think particularly when she's challenged on these ideas.
Right.
She doesn't back down.
She doubles down.
She doubles down, exactly. And I think...
Which brings us back to that phrase she kept using, humanismo mexicano.
Yes.
Which feels like more than just a slogan. This feels like the guiding principle.
Right. It's not just a catchphrase.
Yeah.
This is something very deeply rooted, I think, in Mexican culture and history. This idea of putting people at the heart of everything.
Right.
This focus on social justice, making sure that everybody benefits from, economic development.
And we see that reflected in her policies, right? These social programs.
Yeah, investing in education, healthcare infrastructure, connecting these communities.
Right.
It's all about uplift.
And it's about challenging that status quo, right? Because that energy reform, that's a big deal.
It's huge. And it's really a rejection of this, neoliberal consensus.
It takes guts to stand up to those kinds of interests.
Absolutely. She is really making a statement.
It makes you wonder what kind of impact this could have on other countries in the region.
Oh, absolutely. And Latin America has this, long history with social movements.
Right.
Progressive leaders who are really trying to push back against inequality and exploitation. So I think all eyes are going to be on Mexico to see how this plays out.
That's true.
Will it be successful?
Because if she's successful, it could have this ripple effect.
Exactly. Could be really inspiring.
It could be a whole wave.
A whole new wave of progressive leaders.
It's really inspiring to see a leader with such a strong vision, one that's so rooted in her own culture and history, but also feels relevant to what's happening in the world today.
And it's not just some abstract ideology. We see it in her policies.
Exactly, like her focus on social programs, expanding access to healthcare and education, these infrastructure projects that are connecting these rural communities. It's all about investing in people.
Challenging the status quo.
Mhm.
I mean, think about her decision to reverse those energy reforms from 2013.
Right.
That was a huge deal.
That took some guts.
It did. She really stood up to some powerful interests there.
It makes you wonder what kind of impact this is going to have on other countries in the region. Could this inspire a new wave of progressive leadership in Latin America?
It's possible Latin America has this long history of, social movements and progressive leaders who are fighting against inequality and exploitation. So, her success or even lack thereof in implementing this vision could have this ripple effect throughout the region.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this all plays out.
But even if other countries don't come right out and say, we're adopting the principles of Humanismo Mexicano, there's a lot that can be learned from this.
I think so too. It's a reminder that there are other ways to approach progress and development and how we structure our societies and even our relationship with the planet.
Yeah, and that's something I think we all need to hear a little bit more these days.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this feeling of, I don't know, cautious optimism.
Okay, I like that.
Because it's bold and it's ambitious and it's definitely not going to be easy, but it's refreshing to see a leader with such a clear sense of purpose, one that's grounded in the needs of her people and this real deep commitment to social justice.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, cautious optimism, because the stakes are high, not just for Mexico, but for the future of, this type of politics, progressive politics in the region and even beyond. And her success is going to depend not just on her leadership, but also on, the Mexican people embracing this vision of a more just and equal society. Right, and that's what makes it so interesting.
It is.
It's about power, it's about ideology, the struggle for social justice, but at the heart of it, it's about hope.
Yeah.
Hope for a better future.
Beautifully said.
Not just for Mexico, but for everybody.
And on that note, I'll leave our listeners with this thought. Keep an eye on Mexico because I think what's happening there could have a huge impact for years to come.
Yeah, this is a story that's just beginning.
Exactly.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive into Mexican politics.
That was a good one.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking, maybe even a little inspiring. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.